The fragments of Basilides never mention the word gnosis, but three of the fragments focus on the topic of faith. The first of them gives a definition of faith coming from Basilides himself. This is fragment 13 from Clement Stromata 5.1.3. Quote, "For if one knows God by nature, as Basilides supposes, then faith is a remarkable form of consciousness, as well as a kingdom, the acquirement of goods, and worthy of existing near the Creator's essence." Basilides interprets faith to be an essence, nature, or substance, not as an ability. It's a boundless beauty of an insurpassable creation. He does not call faith a rational assent of the freely choosing soul. In this fragment, Basilides defines faith. Other definitions come from Basilides' disciples, and we'll soon get to those. For Basilides, faith is a form of higher perception and thought. The Greek word here is noesis, which is the activity of nous, the higher consciousness. Faith is remarkable, special, excelling. The Greek is exeritos. All this hints that it's a higher kind of knowing, perhaps the highest. One could call it an intellectualist definition of faith, but I think the point here is this, that faith is a form of consciousness that is actually higher than the normal workings of the human intellect or reason. That is why it opens up to the believer such extraordinary wealth. Faith is a kingdom because it results in the inheritance of God's eternal kingdom, of goods that neither rust corrupts nor moths eat. It is the kind of thought native to the divine world, so it naturally exists alongside the Creator's essence. I think Fasilides assumes here that the supreme deity is the chief creator. This would mean that the being he called the ruler in fragment 4 is not a creator, or that he's only a creator in a secondary or lower sense. The creation of the higher creator is unsurpassable. Initially, this position might seem very different from that of Marcion, but I've argued that for Marcion, the supreme deity is also a higher creator. For undefined and overwhelming beauty, the best passage to compare is the vision of beauty in Diodemus' speech contained in Plato's Symposium 210d. Identifying faith with this sort of beauty would be identifying faith with God, but Basilides calls faith a beauty of an unsurpassed creation. The creation, or ktisis, is evidently a creation of God. Faith is a gift of God. It's also God's creation. This point reinforces the idea that for Basilides, God is a creator. To say that Basilides only believed in creator angels, in line with Irenaeus' report, is thus misleading or insufficient. It's Clement, of course, who wants faith to be a rational assent of the freely choosing soul. He wants it to be an exercise of the will, an exousia, not an ousia or substance. But for Basilides, faith is a substance. As the form of higher consciousness, it participates in reality to a greater degree than material objects. Like is known by like, so faith must share in the higher essence of what it sees. Faith as a substance also clarifies that faith is a gift only given by God. Despite being a substance, however, faith is not in the Ogdoad. Clement later describes Fasilides' position as being faithful and elect by nature. But this term by nature, or physi in Greek, may be Clement's own addition. In the immediate context, Clement mentions Valentinians saved by nature, and this was Clement's favorite phrase to describe the Valentinian theory of salvation. It's unclear how natural faith is for Basilides. Even if it is a substance, it's not necessarily integrated automatically in people at birth. In other fragments, Basilideans bring in the idea of assent. Clement, of course, makes it seem as if for Basilides, the elect are naturally born with faith and they have no free choice and there's no development of faith. But Basilides' actual theory of faith and how one acquires it isn't really explained. It's doubtful that for the person of faith, the commands of the Old and New Covenant are superfluous, as Clement inferred. Basilides might have believed something to the effect that those with faith do not need law to motivate their ethical behavior. But this, of course, was actually a common position, and not just among so called Gnostics. We read in 1 Timothy that, quote, law does not apply to a righteous person. The truth is, as in most points, Clement and Basilides agreed more than they disagreed on the topic of faith. Both opposed the general philosophical tendency to devalue faith as a form of knowledge. If you know Plato's line image, he put faith in the lower half of the line, making it inferior to rational and noetic knowing. Belief is the knowledge gained by seeing physical objects in the world. It's only one step above fantasy. Both Clement and Basilides upgrade faith so that it can effectively be the highest form of knowing, effectively equivalent to gnosis. Both attribute faith to a divine influence. Both represent the idea that Christians, through baptism, truly receive a new quality or ability. Both are trying to present a Gnostic path in which faith is fully integrated. Fragment 2 of Basilides comes from the Stromata 2.3.10. Here we read that the followers of Basilides think that faith is natural. Accordingly, they arrange it for the elect as that which discovers lessons without demonstration from noetic comprehension. Basilides' disciples also say that faith is proper to the election according to each interval. The cosmic faith of every nature follows as a consequence of the supercosmic election. The gift of faith is also proportionate to the hope of each person. And in fragment 3 from Stromata 2.6.27, we find that the followers of Basilides define faith as the ascent of the soul to something which does not stir sensation, since sensation is absent. Hope is the expectation of something good, and the expectation must be faithful. These particular fragments are best handled together. The notion that faith is natural, again, likely reflects Clement's language. He referred to the natural election in Stromata 3.1, and he believed that the Basilidean elect were saved by nature. Basilideans actually said that faith is proper, the Greek here is ikios, which can mean familiar or congenial to the election. Now, election is a biblical term used by a variety of authors. Paul urged his audience to be conscious of their election. Paul emphasized divine election in the book of Romans, and he could also refer to the election as a group of people. The author of 2 Peter urges Christians to strive to make their calling and election sure. Valentinians called themselves the seeds of the elect. And early Catholic authors used this language of election as well. In 1 Clement, the author thanks the Father who made his audience a portion of his election. So the Basilidean use of election in reference to Christians or believers in Jesus is nothing unusual. According to Basilideans, the real question is whether the election designates a special group of Christians or whether it designates all Christians. Evidently, it would include all those who have faith as defined here, which would seem to designate all Christians. Basilideans did refer to each interval of faith, but what exactly they meant by this is unclear. Were there different developmental stages of faith or of the elect? Perhaps the stages of faith determine the stages of the elect. We really don't know. At any rate, for Basilideans, faith is something discovered or it discovers lessons without demonstration. It doesn't stir sensation, that is, our physical 5 senses. So basically, it lacks empirical evidence. But that's logical because the object of faith, which is evidently God in the divine world, isn't empirical in the first place. So if one could prove faith, it wouldn't be faith. And this point corresponds to philosophical discussions. You have faith, according to Aristotle, on your first principles or in your first principles, which are unproven, upon which then you build your system. Clement also believed, perhaps having learned from the Basilideans, that faith as a first principle is unproven, and that was just fine. The lack of proof isn't a problem. It actually contributes to the certainty and stability of faith, because, of course, then it can't be disproved by anything in the empirical world. So the best kind of knowledge, ironically, is that which needs no proof. This kind of knowledge might be called irrational, but it's better to call it super rational, at least from an insider perspective, because the object of this knowledge, that is what faith knows, is above reason. Therefore, reason or rationality cannot possibly prove the object of faith. Knowledge of material things, things which fall into the narrow bandwidth of human perception, is in fact a lesser kind of knowing for these thinkers. Faith knows the invisible and non material reality by a higher mode of consciousness. a mode of consciousness called noetic comprehension. Comprehension here being the Greek katalepsis. This idea of katalepsis, or grabbing, grasping intellectual conception, stems, it seems, from Stoic epistemology, and it indicates a firm grasp of reality. Clement himself insisted that when there is real faith, it's a firm grasp of something. So, noetic comprehension we can think of as the immediate realization of the nous, that higher consciousness, identical with our higher self. The higher consciousness immediately grasps and knows the truth without proof. To put it simply, the elect don't know why they believe in certain things. Some things are simply taken as is by experience, as infallibly true, because they manifest themselves as true according to this higher form of knowing, attuned to a higher reality, which is experienced. Clement agreed that faith was higher or more valid than empirical knowledge. It's in fact the criterion of empirical knowledge. We might think of noetic comprehension as instant and intuitive. It's what in the Valentinian system happened when the seed saw Jesus for the first time. Basilides also used the term assent. An assent is made by the higher consciousness. The assent is given not because the elect judge something to be probable based on sensation, but because they instantly and absolutely know it. So, in effect, Basilides, again, they really didn't distinguish faith and gnosis on the basis of their naturally elect status. They didn't mention anything natural necessarily. For them, it would seem faith was just another way of talking about gnosis. Clement comes close to this notion when he says that gnosis is faithful and that faith is known. But Clement himself, whose larger theory we know, thanks to his work, admitted that Gnostic knowing is something more than having faith, that gnosis existed at the height of faith, that gnosis is the perfection of faith. For Clement, there was a distinction between those who simply take a taste of Scripture and those who go further on in discerning the truth exactly. The first group has faith, the second are the Gnostics. So if the intervals mentioned by Basilides correspond to stages of faith, their idea would be a precursor to Clement's own theory. For Clement, there were at least two stages in the development of faith. It started out as common, but it was perfected by learning. The notion of development and levels is therefore not inherently elitist. At any rate, it's not unclementine. For Basilides, noetic comprehension and what he called remarkable noesis in fragment 13 must refer to the same thing. It's that higher faculty above rationality. Noetic comprehension comes from nous, not logismos or reasoning. The elect must be in their essential selves nous, and that is why at the end of their lives they can become all things, transform into all things, and be invisible to all things, just as the Christ nous. The idea of assent assumes some sort of free will. This sort of assent might be immediate and intuitive, but it still requires an act of will. As Clement himself pointed out, the followers of Plato and the Stoics alike say that our intellectual assent is within our own control. Following this line of thought, Clement underscored that faith needed assent, but here again, this is in agreement with Basilides. Clement consistently overemphasized Basilidean determinism to make a distinction between his thought and theirs, and to be sure there are deterministic elements here. But in fragment 3, at least, Clement cites the Basilidean definition of faith with zero criticism as a support for his own view. What the Basilideans meant by cosmic faith isn't clear. It could simply refer to faith as experienced in the world. Faith follows as a consequence of God's supercosmic election, an election above this world and perhaps prior to it. People in the world have faith because of God's active election. Faith in this sense would be based on the grace of God's prior decision. This is admittedly a Calvinistic reading of the text. There are other readings. Perhaps the prior election wasn't God's. Perhaps the soul, when first created, made a choice for God, and this choice had an effect on the soul's character, such that when incarnated on earth, that soul had faith. So faith is based on the prior act of the soul's choice, the choice to love God. This model for understanding the text would be more like what we find in Origen's First Principles, books 1 and 2, in reference to Jesus. Basilideans related faith and hope, as we see in Hebrews 11:1, where faith is the substance of things hoped, But their definition of hope as the expectation of good comes straight from a Pseudo-Platonic text called the Definitions. And this particular definition of hope was widespread, attested many times in Philo. Basilideans, or perhaps it was Clement, added to this definition that hope must be reliable or trustworthy. I translate this word, pistine, to show as faithful, to show its similarity to faith or pistis. Clement believed that hope is constituted from faith, as he says right before his citation of Fragment 3. His later definition mixes together Basilidean ideas that hope is the expectation of good things which look confidently to an absent good. When we compare other texts, like Polycarp, he also believed that hope followed faith, and the author of the Epistle of Barnabas identified hope with the beginning and end of faith. For Basilideans, faith isn't identical to hope, but it is proportionate. If one has faith, one will also have hope in the good things of God to come. We know very little about Basilidean eschatology, the end times, from the fragments, but if the followers of Basilides had hope, then they must have believed that they would obtain a good possession. We'll say more about Basilidean eschatology when we come to the Refutators' report. Suffice it to say, for now, what Basilians believed about their future inheritance, they certainly considered faithful or trustworthy. It was their faith that made them Gnostics.